Thy word is a lamp unto my feet and a light unto my path.
This morning we'll be discussing Psalms 119, verses 65 through 80. Just to remind you of the thought that is here as we go through Psalms 119, we're talking about a man's cry during adversity, praying for strength in very difficult times, and the love that he has for God's law. In fact, God's law is brought up almost in every verse except just a very few. The other thing that we'll talk about is that the reading today is in two divisions. One, the Hebrew letter Teth, which is the 9th division, and the other being the Hebrew letter Yod, which is the 10th division. And as we've talked about in past, each grouping begins with a Hebrew letter. Since there are 22 letters in the Hebrew alphabet, there are 22 sections within Psalms 119. Today we'll be doing the Hebrew letter Teth first, which is the 9th division. We'll read that and then comment on it, and then go on to Yod, which is the 10th division. There's a slightly different thing. That's why I've chosen to do that way rather than doing the full reading. So let's start at 65 and read. Thou hast dealt well with thy servant, O Lord, according to thy word. Teach me good judgment and knowledge, for I have believed thy commandments. Before I was afflicted, I went astray, but now I have kept thy word. Thou art good and dost good. Teach me thy statutes. The proud have forged a lie against me, but I will keep thy precepts with my whole heart. Their heart is as fat as grease, but I delight in thy law. It is good for me that I may have been afflicted, that I might learn thy statutes. The law of thy mouth is better unto me than thousands of gold and silver. Now, before we get into the explanation on this, there is one section that I thought was difficult, that needed explaining, and that was 70, verse 70. Their heart is fat as grease. What does that mean? That's indicating that these opponents of the person that is suffering here, they are as useless and as worthless as the grease of an animal. When you think about the muscles, the bones, they're all active and they're all working and they have purpose. The fat really does very little for the animal as far as the motion and the activity. So what he's basically saying here is these opponents of his were inactive and worthless, and thus as fat and grease. There are about 5 things that you can kind of pick up in each one of those. And the first one is how graciously God had dealt with him, bringing him successfully through his adversity. Even though he's in adversity, he's still telling God, it is because of you that I'm making it through this. He prays to be taught of God. In other words, to know God's precepts are the very tools that he uses to bring him through his adversity. He's acknowledging the usefulness of God's chastisement. For we know that if God loves us, if we are his sons, we will be chastised. And sometimes the afflictions that we have, even though they're brought about by our enemies or nature or whatever, sometimes it's useful to look at those things as chastisements. And that these things that God does, he's doing it for our good. What a good attitude that is, to look at difficulty in this way. And also, much of the source of his affliction had been at the hands of wicked men. We know that. We are, all who live godly will suffer in this life. And that's sometimes at the hand of the wicked. And then finally, he reviews the mindset of the godly. He sees God's hands in their affliction. They learn his statutes. They prefer his word to earthly treasure. And they persevere in life because of the strength received from God's promises. All these attitudes are things that are possessed by the godly, and they're the things that animate them and move them forward through life. And even though this person is suffering, even this person is crying out for strength, he has learned these tools and he is utilizing them. The next division we're going to do today is the Hebrew letter Yod. That'll be the 10th division. That'll start at verse 73 through verse 80. Let's go ahead and read that together. Thy hands have made me and fashioned me. Give me understanding that I may learn thy commandments. They that fear thee will be glad when they see me, because I have hoped in thy word. I know, O Lord, that thy judgments are right, and that thou in faithfulness hath afflicted me. Let, I pray thee, thy merciful kindness be for my comfort, according to the word unto thy servant. Let thy tender mercies come unto me, that I may live, for thy law is my delight. Let the proud be ashamed, for they dealt perversely with me without cause, but I will meditate in thy precepts. Let those that fear thee turn unto me, and those that have known my testimonies. Let my heart be sound in thy statutes, that I be not ashamed. Again, the key is the statutes. Understanding God's law and understanding what he would have for you as his child. Let's take a look just briefly at this. He starts off the discussion with an argument of why these things should be given to him. And the very interesting thing is that he's invoking the fact that he is a creature created by God, and that he knows that God has special care for him, and so therefore he brings this up as a reason why God should help him with understanding his statutes fully, is because he's a creature who wants to know, who wants to live according to God's law. And then he says, give me understanding. He wants to know what to do. He's God's creature. He's on earth. He's conscious. What do I do next? How do I live? How would we know what to do if we didn't have God's laws? Many have tried in the past. Many have tried to set God aside and establish their own morality to their own demise. It does not work. Why? Because God created us and God is alive. And finally, he asks this for this end. Why is he asking to understand God's precepts? Why is he invoking himself as God's creature, as God's son, for him to help him do this? Why is this so important to him? One of the reasons that he brings out is the fact that as he lives his life in a godly manner, it will impact others. Others will look upon his life and say, this is important. This is something that I must do. And so God, if you teach me your precepts, if you give me these knowledge, I will live it out in my lives, and I will teach it to other men and bring them unto you. The second thing he lists is, I'll recognize thy chastisements as just. Again, as in the previous section, he brings up the fact that God will chastise those that he loves. And that through chastisement and through the fact that he overcomes and learns from these things, he realizes that God's chastisement is good. The third thing is to bolster his faith, that God's promise for mercy is faithful and true. We're told that God will have mercy on those whom he will, and those of his children. And through this chastisement, through this natural progression of afflictions that we have in this life, we learn that God will pull us through. As we pray to him, he is our sustainer and our upholder of all things. The fourth thing he says, as far as the end goal of learning these things, is that he might live. He realizes that he can't live his life unless he lives it within God's precepts. Life cannot be lived properly unless it's lived according to how the Creator has designed us. He has given us a manual of how to use this thing called life. And he can't live unless he understands how to do it through the Creator's method of teaching. And then he says, to let the proud be ashamed. So he realizes that as he lives his life, as he learns the statutes of God and plays them out more perfectly before those that are proud, that have rejected God, that are doing things like oppressing the poor and the widows, as they do that, they'll realize and be ashamed of their conduct, and that through his example, they'll see the proper way to live. And the sixth item was, so that I can meditate on thy statutes when my enemies persecute me. Another aspect of that, but it allows him, as he's being persecuted, to keep his mind laser-like on what the goal is here, going to heaven, obeying God in this life, doing the things that we must do. This is very important because it is hurtful and painful and disorienting when our enemies persecute us. But he's saying that I will meditate on thy law because you have given me a better understanding of thy law through my prayers to you. That this good life will be acknowledged by the godly. This is an important thing for him, that he understands that he'll have brethren in this world, and that he wants to live a life for God so that he can be acknowledged by the godly, for the people that are just like him, that acknowledge the fact that he is living the way God would have him to live. It should be a great joy to us when a brother comes up to it and says things like, I gather strength from you, or you really are a good example for my children, or something like that. It is an affirmation that the effort that you're putting in is good, and so he acknowledges this as an end reason to why he wants to know God's law. And finally, so that he would be sound in the faith, needing not to be ashamed. This is where we all want to be in the end of time, when we face God. We want to be joyous when that trump sounds and the Lord descends with a shout, with the angels with him. We don't want to be afraid. We want to throw our head back and laugh and cry and be just happy to see the Lord, and not to be ashamed that when we're called in judgment, when you come forward, you have nothing to be ashamed of. What a glorious thing that would be, to have that happen. So in closing, this person has done a lot of thought as to why he loves the statutes of God, why he wants to have more, and how they relate to afflictions in this life. I hope this has been helpful. Thank you for listening.